I'm going to start with Umran Beba from Pepsi. If I can ask, and it's a question I'll ask for all three of you. First, I've defined the innovation piece of our equation. What does diversity mean at your firm? And we'll talk about how you connect it to innovation in the course of our conversation together. And I'm going to make this interactive, so please think of questions. It's a rare treat to have such talent on a stage, so let's think of good questions for them as we go along. But let's start with you. Yeah. Tell us, what does diversity mean? And how is it changing at your company?
Yeah, if you look at PepsiCo, of course, I mean, we operate in 200 countries, and we are a food and beverage company, which means we are a global company, highly global company, but we have to address the local needs. Therefore, we have to represent our consumers and customers in the workforce. I think that's part of diversity and why we are interested in it. And then we would like to hear different voices. We would like to have different ideas in the room representing the consumer and customer. But also we are interested to hear every voice. So I will talk later about how our innovation process is supporting that. But that's why we are interested in diversity, because that's our business. We are in a global business, but it has to be very locally reasonable or value-adding, as you said.
Right.
Make sense for our consumers and customers.
So you want to reflect
Yes.
your customers because of their global nature, but also you are looking, obviously, to reflect points of view.
Points of view, and of course, which will drive innovation
Sure.
and better ways of creating impact in the world.
Janet, how would you answer that question? It's, again, one of those simple-minded questions, but it hides a lot of complexity.
Yeah.
What does diversity mean for your firm?
Yeah,
And just a proper introduction, of course. I know you all have the program, but Janet Roller is at Marriott. In fact, you're with a unit called CX Innovation.
Yes.
It sounds like some kind of skunk works where they're coming up with stealth hotels or something that, you'll be walking by, there's a pop-up hotel or something, I'm not sure. But
it's not too far from the truth.
Right. But tell us, what is it at Marriott? What do you think about when we talk about diversity?
Yeah, when we talk about diversity, as a brand, we're not quite to 200 countries yet, but we're almost there. Marriott has had a long history of hotels. We know that the travel industry is changing every single day. And so when we think about diversity, it's certainly in terms of the customers that we serve, but also the reasons for why they travel. So it's not just the stays for business, but also we talk about diversity in terms of leisure and other forms of travel. Diversity to us means everything from how we change our value proposition in the countries that we operate in, but also who we work with, whether it be startups or large partnerships in the landscape. So it's really changing every day.
So you're stretching the diversity discussion to say not just the obvious questions about ethnic makeup or something, which we are all aware of, but in addition, you're looking at perhaps the divergent needs of different groups, exactly. Which may be representing where they come from and where they aspire to go to. And so that's an interesting way to also think about the topic. And let me introduce our final speaker, Anne Anaya, who's here with 3M. And maybe I could ask the same question of you, if you could tell us diversity, how do you think about it? You have obviously a renowned shop. I think every person in this room has probably used your product at least once, probably many times without knowing it. But how do you think about diversity?
Well, thank you. I first have to just beg your indulgence. I am a recovering lawyer of 20 years and new to HR. So I see diversity through that dimension. I've worked on...
See, we have diversity even on the panel in terms of intellectual frame of reference.
Yes. So I took on the role of Chief Diversity Officer a year ago and did a tour of listening and benchmarking. And much like your introduction related to the word innovation, diversity is complex. You won't get a room normally that will completely agree in the value of diversity. In fact, you'll have different dimensions of that word being absolutely positive and some very negative. So when I did this tour of listening, what I found is that there were individuals within our company, and I would argue perhaps our society, that are feeling very excluded when we use the word diversity. So, having been a lawyer for 20 years, I thought the first thing to do is to change the language that we were using. And so diversity means what it has always meant at 3M. We have a diversity index, which follows representation in different groups. But we now focus on not just diversity, but the yes and of inclusion. And so we also have an inclusion index. And so the thought was we would launch a campaign that was consistent with our marketing campaign, our branding campaign, and our design campaign that used language that was consistent with those campaigns and strategies, but focused on broadening the tent of inclusion. So the campaign is Different Minds Inspire, changing the word diversity into different, changing the focus on how you look to how you think and your perspective.
Can you give us just another couple of sentences on how this inclusion measurement works or index?
Yes, so what we did is we took 11 questions within our standard opinion survey to measure inclusion both in your work experience, in your team experience, and then through leadership. And with those questions, we established a baseline of whether or not individuals felt included. And that baseline will be measured every 2 years to see our progress as to those that feel neutral, positive, neutral, or negative about inclusion.
What's the best question out of those? Just again, to understand, what are you asking these people?
Whether or not they feel valued in many different ways. That's in 11 different ways. That's really the question.
I see.
Whether you feel valued and whether you feel like you belong.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? It's hard to do. I mean, so my thoughts are with you as you embark on this mission. That's very hard to get at, but be interested to follow your progress with that.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So we have a sense of how different companies are even defining what is diversity for them and why, led by marketplace pressures or some internal desires, maybe a reason to connect with how they come up with new products in a better way. How does this connect with what is at the heart of what every one of your three companies does, which is innovation? And in particular, I want to posit that the way that innovation was typically done in corporate settings, Fortune 500 settings in the last many decades, was very top-down. Models like Xerox PARC, AT&T's famous Bell Labs, and we could list many others, where centralized laboratories and centers, IP was held very close to the chest, and great new products were invented or breakthroughs, and gray beards with white coats would hand down these wonderful products, and the rest of the company would spread them around the world. That was the classic way of doing product development. It led to what had been called multinational advantage for particularly American and European companies as they went around the world. But we know we've lived through a revolution in the last 20 years, and not just because of new technologies which are disruptive, but also because of the rise of extraordinary companies in places like China and India and Brazil, disruptive new business models coming up, and that has challenged and eroded the so-called multinational advantage in many markets and forced big companies to think about inventing and innovating in much more open ways. Open, collaborative, even user-generated kinds of innovation are really beginning to play a complementary or even primary role in how many companies think about innovation. But at the same time, you go to a corporate headquarters, you have lawyers in the mix who think about, don't corrupt the IP, we need to be careful with our partnerships. And so companies can't completely shed their ways. So give us an insight, I might ask, starting with Janet. How does it really work at your company? Because all of you think about both the diversity question, but also in a moving target of innovation. Does it help you or does it hinder you when you think about the diversity question? And maybe give us a sense of how it's working at your company.
Absolutely. Marriott is, innovation has been part of the DNA from Marriott from the time that it started. So I like to call Marriott.
You have to say that once a day, every day at the company?
I look in the mirror every day. No, I'm just kidding. I like to say that it's a 90-year young company. If you don't know the history of Marriott, Marriott actually started as a root beer shop. Back in the kind of early 1900s, when Mr. Marriott, the original, drove across the country with his wife to start a new life in Washington, D.C., and they started with a root beer shop. And then when it got to be winter time, they realized that ice-cold root beer doesn't sell in the winter time. And so Alice Marriott, the famous story goes, is that she went to the Mexican embassy, knocked on their door, sweet-talked her way into learning the recipe for how to make some different kind of foods, and then brought in chili and all kinds of stuff into this root beer shop. And that was sort of the sparking of innovation and how to be really nimble and to pivot, back a long time ago. And so that DNA of innovation and just kind of like flexing, when environmental conditions are different than what your expectations are, has been part of the brand since the very, very beginning. Translate that to where we're at right now, I think we could all say that innovation cycles are continuing to get faster. Disruptors are coming and disrupting industries that you sort of thought were, quote unquote, safe from the beginning of time. There's a company that you might have heard of called Airbnb, that we pay attention to. And so there's a lot of change that's happening all the time, and what that has done to force Marriott's perspective on innovation is that even though there are fundamental things that the business needs to take care of on an everyday basis, we're going through a massive integration right now with our acquisition of Starwood. Our Chief Commercial Officer, Stephanie Lindquist, is always saying the phrase of innovate while you integrate. You can't just do integration and you can't just do the foundation without also growing in your competitive advantage. And so that's been very much in the spirit of Marriott's perspective of innovation. Within the CX innovation team, so CX is customer experience. I know it sounds like skunk works, like we're sitting in some crazy lab with VR goggles on all the time, and so that's only true for a fraction of the team. But I think for us, even with technology and the role that technology plays in people's lives, we are a very human-centered company. When you come to a Marriott property, it's a human that is greeting you, that's taking care of your hotel, your entire experience. And so
They do have robot hotels in Japan.
We do. We have.
You have one of those?
We don't have one, but
they exist, right?
They do.
But that's not how you see the future. I guess.
And when we've done tests with Bottler, and we're doing a lot with chatbots and AI, and we just recently announced a partnership with Amazon where we are their launch partner for their Alexa for Hospitality division, and so you'll have Alexas in several of our Marriott hotels coming here soon.
What will the Alexa offer?
So a wide range of things that meet your travel needs. And so our team, it's kind of a funny story. So we had worked with Amazon last year around defining whether or not the option of offering Alexa in hotel rooms was even something that could be A, viable, and B, desirable. And so that's also a thing that we talk a lot about on our specific innovation team. We talk about the intersection of desirability, so do people want it? Is it viable? Is there a financial return to it or a business model behind it? And is it feasible? So is it operationally, can you do it? And the intersection of all three is where we talk about our sweet spot of innovation. But we also believe in rapid learning and rapid testing. And so pretty quickly we stood up a test in our W Hotel in Austin where we put in an Alexa, and our team is the one that worked alongside with Amazon to do the programming of like the coding, kind of everything. And it ranged from everything from getting my car from car service, or from valet rather, to setting an alarm, to sing me a lullaby so I can go to bed,
Nice.
to kind of everything in between. And so we got some really rapid learnings that ultimately informed the direction. So it's a whole suite of offerings that we offer. Right?
So a couple of things, I guess, come out from that example particularly, but maybe we can generalize to your approach to innovation. Aside from having a dedicated innovation unit, which you are, but you also seem to have some of the principles of design thinking,
Correct.
rapid prototyping that you're trying to bring to the customer experience. Try it, and if it doesn't work, move quickly. And so that seems to be informing part of how you think about your innovation efforts.
Very, very core to our belief system.
And you have a new home sharing partner. Is that you trying to do a Airbnb thing, or what's different about it? And again, connected back to what does it show us about how a very large company that has swallowed another very large company is trying to move nimbly when you've obviously got a lot of legacy assets and culture as well.
And whether it's swallowing or I don't know, there's still a lot happening on that front with that analogy. But absolutely, I think another principle to our approach from innovation that's different than what you talked about from, kind of innovation of legacy past is we're increasingly looking outwards. So innovation in a lot of companies in the past was very insular. It's kind of like you lock people in a room and they only talk to each other, and that's how you get innovation. But we've realized that there's so much value in spreading out and not just working with other big companies like Amazon, for example, but also startups. And so, we, through a travel experience incubator that we launched in partnership with Accenture and then a local startup network in DC, identified these 5 different startups from around the world, so diversity in terms of where they're from, but also their solutions that they're bringing to the table. And one of the really amazing success stories was this brand out of London called Hostmaker, and they are a home rental sharing management company with properties all over Europe. And so we worked with them to identify what a solution for Marriott could be in the home sharing space. And so we, at the end of April, our team in partnership with Hostmaker launched Tribute Portfolio Homes. And how it's different is that we really wanted to lean into the pain point that we uncovered through our design thinking research around how when people travel, and a lot of our guests do this, when they're traveling with their family, they need more space than what a hotel can offer. They want a kitchen, they want multiple bedrooms, and it's just hard to do that in a hotel today with the structure that we have in place. And so we felt like we were missing something in our product portfolio. But we also knew that Marriott is a brand that stands for trust, for credibility, for standards. You go into a Marriott, you know that you're going to have a really great experience and someone's going to take care of you. And so within the home space, there's so much variety in terms of what's offered that we really wanted to segment the market and focus in on what we felt like could live up to our standards.
So you wanted to take the square peg and put it into a round hole?
Or kind of create a new hole, I guess, a little bit, or shave off what we wanted, I guess, of the peg. But
I mean, all of us, how many of you have stayed at an Airbnb? Ever? I'm surprised, actually not 100%, it's about 60, 70%. And the experience is variable, as you point out, right? It really depends. And no matter how much research you do online, you never know what's really going to be there. So I appreciate that, if you can give the assurance of Marriott. But how do you do this? And again, is it the app or the company you are partnering that's really the secret sauce, or are you bringing something yourself?
Absolutely, we're doing it together, and I think that's where bring it back to diversity and how the definition of diversity can be applied in so many different ways. I think there were a lot of people from Marriott that thought like, oh, home sharing, we know how to manage hotels, we do it every single day. But working with a startup whose knowledge and their expertise is in managing a distributed model, like the idea of managing and operationalizing 500 units in a hotel is different than managing 500 homes spread out over an entire city.
Sure.
Right? And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to diversify the partner that we worked with that was an expert in that field, and that's allowed us. We started this conversation really in earnest with them in January, and we launched at the end of April. So if you think about that from an innovation cycle standpoint, to launch a proof of concept, that's a new business model, a new market, new branding, everything in less than 4 months. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Yeah. So if you're staying in London, come talk to me, and you can stay in a Tribute Portfolio home.
Okay, all right. Anne, if I can come to you about your firm. Lots of case studies have been written about innovation successes of the past, but the world is changing, and how are you changing with it in terms of how you innovate? If you can give us a couple of the ideas. I had the pleasure of visiting many years ago in writing my book on innovation, and got to know some of the ways in which you empower your smartest and brightest people, give them time to think on their own projects. Something that Google has made famous with their 20% time, but I think you were doing it before. But give us a sense of how innovation works and how is it changing to reflect how the world is changing.
Sure. So I'm going to bring us back to away from the robot takeover of the world and to a granular level of back to the basics of how we were approaching diversity and inclusion and how that was touching or not touching innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So back to my listening tour, I met with one of my brilliant colleagues in Japan, Takatashi Akubo, who is the director of corporate process innovation and quality assurance. And he's a professor in addition to being many-decade employee of 3M. And what he has really perfected and written a book about is the science of inclusion and how that science tells us that we have a biological need to feel included. And if we fulfill that need, we, the employee, are more innovative and creative and really rise to a higher potential. So in the spirit of industrial psychology, it really is about training your leaders and your managers to be responsible for creating that environment, to allow for your employees to be their best creative and innovative self. And it really is a very simple approach, which is the idea of the manager's responsibility to create stretch opportunities for innovation, to support both success and failure in those endeavors, which leads us back to our McKnight principle of many years ago, meaning that McKnight, our founder, really thought that you have to allow for people to experiment with innovation, allow them to fail, allow them to succeed, but always to support those endeavors, and then reward success. So this cycle of stretch, support, and reward is what my friend Taka has perfected and deployed. And we then brought it back to the main campus in St. Paul and tried to use that style in a way that made sense for the previous teachings that the main campus had related to diversity and inclusion. And that included being informed by this idea of leadership multipliers. So this is a takeoff from Liz Wiseman's book called Multipliers. And we've created it to mean something relevant for 3M, and that is inclusion multipliers that deploy leadership behaviors that support the idea of a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. Meaning you start from the idea that everybody is capable and gifted, just have to find a way to make it bloom. And it is the leader, it is the manager that holds the responsibility for making that happen. So this is innovation that begins with the idea of what is in the culture, what is in the environment that allows for innovation to bloom.
This is really fascinating. I'm wondering how it is, now that you've told the managers or made it part of your mandate that this is something they must do, how do you make sure it happens? Leadership that inspires inclusive behavior, that's what we're talking about, right?
Right.
You're a science-based organization. Do you measure? Do you have metrics? Or would that be the wrong way to go, that you'll suffocate what is essentially maybe a creative process? How do you think about this, again, because you need to track and measure? I know you benchmarked. You took a year to benchmark things.
Right.
I imagine you're tracking this too.
Yes.
So tell us how, if I'm a manager under this new approach, what are you expecting of me specifically?
Right. So the diversity and inclusion team is a mighty army of 5. We are a global company in 70 countries, 90,000 employees. So as part of that reality, what I decided I needed was an army. I knew I wouldn't get the FTEs for that army, so a volunteer army. So what we decided to do is create inclusion champions, and that is for every business, function, and country around the world. Inclusion champions have been and are being appointed to create their own teams. And those teams will respond to the results of the Inclusion Index survey, but also respond to the needs of the business or the function in a way that makes sense to support innovation. So we'll have quarterly meetings to make sure we're all aligned and we're all using and moving in the same direction, using the same language. But the idea is to make the innovative push relevant to where they are and what they're doing.
Right. You don't want a one-size-fits-all, obviously, because that
Absolutely
wouldn't make sense. But it's very interesting, though. You've managed to mobilize, I presume, more than 5 others to join you.
Yes.
This is mighty army, and so it's sort of a living and breathing effort
Absolutely.
to bring this to life.
It's evolving as we speak.
Okay, great. Let's ask Umran. Pepsi is known for making all sorts of clever new products that people around the world like to munch or snarf or enjoy in various ways. So you have been innovative for a long time. What's changing?
So at this point, I mean, for the last 7 years, we moved into the, first of all, global category teams with regional category leadership representation. So yes, there is a global small team looking after the trends, etc., and creating the agenda or setting the agenda, but there is co-creation, absolutely, because again, the nature of our business, we need to be really understanding the local needs and representing those local needs. Lay's might be a global brand, but we will have a seaweed flavor in China or Japan, or again, a very adapted version in Thailand. So that's the reality. Global category teams with local representation and co-creation. But very recently, we are moving into the second phase of this change, which is again driven by the external factors, which is called the distributed network model. And in this model, the lead markets will be basically leading that innovation, because sometimes, UK might be interested in one idea and invest in it more time, then the others will be around that idea and supporting. So it's still a global project, but one country, the most interested will lead it as a lead market, and they will still work with these global teams. Then the third very important part is the responsive working methodology that we are adopting, which is similar to the agile way of working. But what I like about that methodology, these are small empowered teams. They can make decisions, but they have to meet regularly and progress the project. And if they have barriers, they will take it to the next level or wherever the decision has to be made. But they have some principles, and one of the principles is very much into the diversity field. It's called rounds. Everybody in the group has to speak. Because normally that's the issue, in our corporate worlds, you have meetings, 2 people speak, the 5 will not. But the core principle of this responsive working is SLAM teams. They meet every week. And by the way, they don't need to meet in a room. Of course, it's virtual. But virtual, another principle is everybody has to connect via Zoom. I have to see your face. I have to build a relationship. It's not like you are on the phone and doing something else, right? So that face-to-face connection still happens. Everybody should speak. And then they call it weekly ship. They have to move the ship. And if there are barriers, they will take it to the decision making. But in general, they are empowered. So this is totally in line, I think, with the diversity principles, and I want to put actually this rounds module into our diversity training, let's say, suite, because it's definitely totally in line. And the fourth important piece is the overall design thinking, and we were talking about it. This is not anymore a brand or a product launch. It's about the whole experience. So more and more, for example, recently we have a project called Drinkfinity. So we have
what's it called? Dreamfinity?
Drinkfinity.
Oh, Drinkfinity. Okay,
this is a special bottle. You have to get the bottle, but also then you have the capsules. And when you mix that capsule with the water, you will get the flavor you want in your bottle. So you don't need to buy the bottle every time, but you have your own bottle where you can just buy the pods. And just create your, very special, sometimes organic, sometimes, you know, special nutritious kind of drink. So that's the way actually design thinking comes into play here. Therefore, we were also talking about, we have a design center that's established in New York here, in Soho. We have also a content studio. And purposefully, they are not in our head office.
Right.
They are somewhere outside. They are closer to actually where the action is. But again, it is not only in New York.
Is it fair to say that headquarters has a little bit of a button-down reputation?
I mean, headquarters, you know, they have a certain role, right? Strategy setting, governance, putting policies in place.
Right.
Of course, there are global teams, but if you want to really get the full creativity, you set them apart,
right,
and you make them very global and regionally focused. So, for example, our design team, yes, they have a head office in New York, Soho, but they have representatives in China. And actually, China was one of the first places we put some designers. In the beginning, they were not Chinese, they were Italian, but speaking Chinese, so that was okay. But now in time, we are actually recruiting a lot of designers from those locations also, and it's a global team.
Right.
The important thing is they get together, they talk the same language, but they are very close to the business. And I think that's the whole idea about the global teams, the design teams. And design teams are part of the global category team, because they have to, you know, have the innovation together with marketing, design, R&D. I think that's the other piece that's changing. Now this is a multifunctional activity. In the past, you know, marketing was leading innovation, they say what they say, and the others, they had to do what they had to do. But now, from the beginning, you have to even take finance into that, or legal into that activity, because otherwise it's too late. We don't have that much time. It's the sense of urgency, the agility. So that's the last point. Maybe we are also doing some pilots around agility in the organization. We have a program where we test our leaders' agility index in a way, and then nudge them with different learning experiences to improve the agility as a leader. Because I believe at the end, this change cannot be only owned by the company. It has to be owned at the individual level. So the individual resilience and individual agility and the leadership agility will be critical for innovation. And that's what also we are trying to improve in the organization to support innovation and growth.
So the picture that emerges really is, I mean, for a company that's been very successful, that your approach is accelerating in terms of the agility and speed you're talking about, but also the decentralization. You're empowering remote groups, groups that are not at headquarters, maybe country leads and so on, as well as encouraging this kind of listening to every voice in your
I think
conversations.
with one specific remark there, we are leveraging our global scale, but do it in a very sensitive way to the local reality and co-creation. Therefore, you are right. Maybe in the past, companies went through those cycles of, here is the global product, who is launching it? You can't do it anymore. You have to really create it together, and then when it is ready, they will just launch it, because otherwise there is a selling activity in the company that needs to go through, and it takes time. We don't have time for that. It has to be co-created and launched. I don't have time to sell my idea to, let's say, UK or Mexico or India.
You want them bought in already.
I mean, from day one,
sure.
If they are interested, they are part of the group. If they
Right.
are not, they will be part of another group
Right.
or the third group. So that's the way it works.
Sure. That's great.